Imagine the U.S. president receiving a letter from an Iowa farmer begging him to save his land from bankruptcy. Instead of ignoring it, he gets on a plane, but the visit turns into an unexpected battle that changes the fate of millions. What made him come back a second time? The Oval Office was a hive of activity, as always. Papers shuffled, phones buzzed, and aides darted in and out with clipped efficiency. President Jonathan Gray sat behind the resolute desk, his sharp blue eyes scanning a stack of correspondence that had been filtered by his team. Most of it was predictable: requests for photo ops, pleas from lobbyists, the usual noise of Washington. But then his fingers brushed against something different. A single envelope, worn at the edges, with handwriting that looked like it had been scratched out in a hurry. No fancy letterhead, no official seal, just ink on paper. He slid it open with a silver letter opener, curiosity piqued. The letter was from Jake Thompson, a 28-year-old farmer from Iowa. No "Dear Mr. President" formality, just a blunt opening. "I don't know if you'll read this, but we're drowning out here. My farm's on the brink, and I'm not the only one. Come see it for yourself if you've got the guts." Gray's lips twitched into a half-smile. Guts? Most people didn't talk to him like that. Not anymore. The letter went on, raw and unpolished. Rising fuel costs, crashing crop prices, and corporate giants snapping up land like vultures. Jake didn't ask for a handout. He demanded a visit. "You say you're for the little guy," he wrote. "Prove it." Gray leaned back in his chair, tapping the letter against his palm. His chief of staff, Margaret Hensley, poked her head in. "Sir, you've got the trade briefing in 10. She glanced at the envelope in his hand. "What's that?" "A farmer from Iowa," Gray said, voice low. "Want me to see his place." Margaret snorted. "Another sob story? Toss it to the AG department." But Gray didn't move. He stared at the jagged handwriting, the ink smudged like it had been written in the cab of a tractor. Something about it stuck with him, maybe the defiance, maybe the honesty. He'd built his campaign on bold moves, on shaking up the system. Ignoring this felt wrong. "Get the plane ready," he said suddenly, standing up. Margaret blinked. "Sir, I'm going to Iowa." She stared, mouth half open. "You've got a full schedule, trade talks, the energy bill." "Reschedule it." He cut in, already grabbing his coat. "This guy's got something to say. I want to hear it." By noon, Air Force One was slicing through the clouds, bound for Des Moines. The press pool scrambled to catch up, speculating wildly about the unannounced trip. Aides whispered among themselves. Gray wasn't known for sticking to protocol, but this was next-level impulsive. As the plane descended, Iowa's patchwork fields came into view, endless rows of corn and soybeans stretching to the horizon. The motorcade rolled out from the tarmac, kicking up dust on gravel roads that hadn't seen a presidential visit in decades. Secret Service agents, stone-faced in their black SUVs, scanned the flat terrain, hands resting on their holsters. Up ahead, a weathered farmhouse loomed, Jake Thompson's place. The air smelled of earth and diesel when Gray stepped out, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the dirt. The farmhouse was modest, its paint peeling, a rusted windmill creaking in the breeze. A figure emerged from the barn, tall, broad-shouldered, with a mop of dark hair under a faded cap. Jake Thompson wiped his hands on his jeans, calluses catching the sunlight, and walked over with a stride that said he wasn't here to bow or scrape. "Mr. President," Jake said, voice steady but edged with something sharp. "Didn't think you'd actually show." Gray met his gaze, unflinching. "You called me out. I don't back down from a challenge." Jake's eyes narrowed, sizing him up. "Good, because I've got a hell of a lot to say." The agents fanned out, their earpieces crackling as they secured the perimeter. A beat of silence hung between the two men, the wind rustling the crops behind them. Gray could feel it. This wasn't just a courtesy call. Something big was brewing, and it started right here on this patch of Iowa dirt. The Iowa sun beat down on the cracked earth as President Jonathan Gray stood face-to-face with Jake Thompson, the air thick with the scent of hay and unspoken tension. Jake's hands, rough and scarred from years of toil, hung loose at his sides, but his posture screamed defiance. Around them, Secret Service agents spread out like shadows, their dark sunglasses reflecting the endless fields. A faint hum of radios buzzed in the background, but here, in this moment, it was just the two men and a brewing storm. "You've got 5 minutes," Gray said, crossing his arms, his voice carrying that clipped authority he'd honed over years of boardrooms and debates. Say what you need to say. Jake didn't flinch. 5 minutes won't cut it, Mr. President. You're here now, so you're going to hear the whole damn thing. He stepped closer, his boots crunching the gravel. We're not just struggling out here. We're dying. Fuel's through the roof, crop prices are in the gutter, and the banks are circling like sharks. Meanwhile, corporate suits sit in their high-rises, buying up our land for pennies. You tell me you're for the little guy. Where's the proof? Gray's jaw tightened, but a flicker of amusement danced his eyes. He wasn't used to being talked to like this. Not since the campaign trail, at least. I've pushed tax breaks, trade deals, more than most before me. Farmers got a boost. A boost? Jake barked a laugh, sharp and bitter. Tell that to my neighbors who lost their deeds last month. Tell that to the folks choosing between groceries and tractor gas. Your boost isn't reaching us. It's padding the pockets of the big dogs. He jabbed a finger toward the horizon, where a distant grains silo gleamed under corporate branding. They're the ones winning. We're just collateral damage. The agents shifted, hands hovering near their belts. One murmured into his sleeve, eyes locked on Jake's rising voice. Gray raised a hand, signaling them to stand down. You're pissed. I get it. But the system's not built to. Don't give me system excuses, Jake snapped, cutting him off. You're the president. Fix it. Or are you just here to shake my hand and fly back to your marble castle? The air grew heavy, charged like the calm before a thunderstorm. Gray's cool exterior cracked for a split second, a twitch at the corner of his mouth, but he held his ground. I don't run from problems, kid. Effacing. So what's your big ask? Jake locked eyes with him, unflinching. Stop the corporations from swallowing us whole. Level the playing field. We're not begging for charity. We're begging for a fighting chance. Before Gray could respond, a screen door creaked open behind them. A woman stepped out onto the porch, her auburn hair tied back, apron dusted with flour. Emily, Jake's wife, carried a quiet strength in her stride as she approached. Gentlemen, she said, her voice soft but firm, slicing through the tension like a blade. Whatever this is, it's not getting solved out here in the dirt. Come inside. There's coffee and cornbread and maybe a chance to actually talk. Jake shot her a glance, half annoyed, half relieved. Gray tilted his head, studying her for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. He gestured toward the house. Lead the way. Emily turned, and the men followed, the crunch of their steps echoing in the stillness. The agents trailed at a distance, their vigilance unwavering as the trio crossed the threshold into the farmhouse. Inside, the air was warm, laced with the smell of baked goods and worn wood. The kitchen was small, but lived in. Faded curtains, a chipped table, and a fridge humming in the corner. Emily set a plate of golden cornbread on the table, steam curling up from the edges. Jake pulled out a chair, sitting with a thud. This ain't a social call. Doesn't mean we can't be civil, she replied, pouring coffee into mismatched mugs. She slid one toward Gray, who took it with a nod. He's here, Jake. Say what you mean, but let him breathe. Gray sipped the coffee, black and strong, then set it down. All right, Thompson, you got my attention. Lay it out, plain and simple. Jake leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice dropping to a low, steady burn. Plain and simple? We're losing everything. My farm's got a week before the bank forecloses. Corporate buyers are already lined up, licking their chops. You want to know what's killing us? It's not just money, it's power. They've got it. We don't. Gray's fingers tapped the mug, his mind racing. This wasn't a briefing room with charts and stats. This was real, raw, and right in his face. And damn if it didn't hit harder than he'd expected. The kitchen felt smaller now, the walls closing in as the weight of Jake Thompson's words hung over the scratched wooden table. President Jonathan Gray sat across from him, the untouched cornbread cooling between them, its golden edges catching the dim light of a flickering bulb overhead. Emily leaned against the counter, arms crossed, her eyes darting between the two men like a referee waiting for the next punch. The hum of the fridge was the only sound breaking the silence after Jake's bombshell. His farm had a week before the bank took it all. Gray set his coffee mug down with a soft clink, his brow furrowing. A week? How'd it get that bad? Jake's laugh was hollow, scraping the air. How? Years of getting squeezed, that's how. Seed costs double, fuel's a fortune, And the price we get for corn? Barely covers the damn tractor oil. Then the bank calls in the loan, says we're high risk. Meanwhile, some suit from AgriCorp's already got a bid in for my land. They'll turn it into another factory farm before the ink's dry. He leaned back, hands gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. That's the game, Mr. President. We're pawns. Gray's fingers drummed the table, a slow, deliberate rhythm. He'd heard the stats, rural decline, corporate consolidation, but this was different. This was a man staring down the barrel of losing everything, not a line on a chart. What's the bank's excuse? He asked, voice steady but edged with curiosity. Missed payments, Jake said flatly. 3 months. Had to choose between the mortgage and fixing the harvester. Guess which one keeps food on the table? Emily stepped forward, her voice quiet but piercing. It's not just us. Half the county's in the same boat. They're calling it market correction. I call a land grab. Gray's eyes flicked to her, then back to Jake. He took a bite of the cornbread, crumbly, warm, with a hint of sweetness, and chewed slowly, buying time to think. Tastes like home, he said, almost to himself. Then louder. So what's your fix? You're not just venting. You've got an idea. Jake straightened, his gaze locking onto Gray's. A law. Something real. Cap how much land these corporations can snatch up. Break their chokehold on prices. Give us a damn lifeline. Tax breaks that actually hit our pockets, not theirs. You've got the pen. Use it. Gray swallowed, setting the cornbread down. You're talking a war with big AG. They've got lobbyists thicker than flies on a feedlot. It's a hell of a risk, politically, economically. And losing farms like mine isn't. Jake shot back, his voice rising. You think food grows itself? If we go under, your cities starve. That's your risk. The room pulsed with a challenge. Emily slid a plate toward Jake, a silent nudge to cool off, but he ignored it. Gray leaned forward, elbows on the table, meeting Jake's fire with his own. I don't back down from fights, Thompson. But I need more than passion. I need a plan that sticks. Then listen, Jake said, voice dropping to a fierce whisper. Last month, AgriCorp bought out my neighbor's place. Foreclosure hit, and they swooped in with cash the bank wouldn't lend us. It's a rigged game. They tank the prices, wait us out, then scoop up the pieces. Stop that, and you stop the bleeding. Gray's mind churned. He'd tangled with giants before, trade deals, oil barons, but this felt dirtier, more personal. He was about to respond when Emily's voice cut through again. There's more, she said, stepping to the fridge. She pulled out a stack of papers, dropping them in front of Gray with a thud. Auction notice. Dated 3 days from now. They're not waiting for the bank. They're jumping the gun. Gray scanned the document, his jaw tightening. 3 days? That's not legal. Doesn't matter, Jake said. They've got lawyers. We've got nothing. The twist landed like a punch. Gray flipped through the pages. Fine print, corporate letterhead, a date circled in red. This wasn't just a slow bleed. It was a calculated hit. He looked up, meeting Jake's eyes. They're playing dirty. Always have, Jake replied. Question is, what are you going to do about it? Gray pushed the papers aside, his mind racing. I'll think on it. Hard. Think fast, Jake said, voice low. We're out of time. Emily broke the silence, sliding another piece of cornbread toward Gray. It's not just numbers, Mr. President. It's us. Families. Roots. Her words landed softer than Jake's, but hit just as deep. Gray nodded, taking the piece, his fingers brushing the rough edge. For the first time, he didn't have a quick answer. The stakes had just shot through the roof, and something in him shifted. 3 weeks had passed since President Jonathan Gray left Jake Thompson's farmhouse, the taste of cornbread and the sting of hard truths still lingering in his mind. Back in Washington, he'd been a whirlwind. Meetings with aides, late-night calls with policy wonks, and a stack of reports on corporate land grabs that grew taller by the day. Jake's words echoed. We're out of time. The auction notice, dated just days away, had lit a fire under him. He wasn't a man to sit idle, and this wasn't a problem he could delegate. Not anymore. Out in Iowa, Jake was elbow-deep in mud, wrestling a busted fence post back into the ground. The sky was gray, heavy with the promise of rain, and the clock was ticking. 2 days until the bank and AgriCorp claimed his land. He hadn't heard from Gray since the visit, and hope, fragile as it was, had started to fray. Emily watched him from the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, The auction papers crumpled in her pocket. Then the radio in Jake's truck crackled to life, cutting through the wind. "We interrupt this broadcast. President Gray has just signed an executive order targeting corporate overreach in agriculture. Small farmers to get emergency protections, effective immediately." Jake froze, wrench in hand, mud streaking his face. He bolted to the truck, cranking the volume. The reporter's voice spilled out. "The order halts predatory land auctions, freezes corporate purchases over a certain threshold, and pumps relief funds into rural banks. Gray calls it a lifeline for America's backbone." Emily ran out, her eyes wide. "Did he?" "He did," Jake said, voice hoarse. He stared at the radio, disbelief warring with a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. That night, the phone rang. Jake snatched it up, still in his work boots. "Yeah. Thompson, it's Gray." The president's voice was unmistakable, clipped and confident. "You hear the news?" Jake leaned against the wall, catching his breath. "Heard it. Didn't believe it till now." "Believe it," Gray said. "Your farm's safe for now. But I'm not done. I want you in D.C. on a council. Farmers need a voice, and yours cuts through the bullshit." Jake blinked, stunned. "Me? Im no suit." "Exactly," Gray shot back. "You're real. Think it over." He hung up before Jake could argue. Emily grinned, nudging him. "Told you he listened." Jake rubbed his neck, still reeling. "Maybe, but the bank's still sniffing around. They're mad as hell about this order. Say it's interference." She frowned. "Can they fight it?" "They'll try," he said grimly. "Always do." The next morning, word spread like wildfire through Iowa's rural pockets. Farmers gathered at diners, swapping stories over coffee. Foreclosures paused, loan officers backpedaling. But the victory was bittersweet. Jake got a call from the bank manager, voice dripping with venom. "This stunt won't hold. We got lawyers. Enjoy your little win. It's temporary." Jake slammed the phone down, fists clenched. The order was a shield, but the war wasn't over. 2 days later, a black SUV rolled up the driveway, dust swirling in its wake. Gray stepped out, tie loosened, flanked by agents and a woman in a sharp blazer. Some AG expert, Jake guessed. Emily rushed to the door, Jake trailing behind, wiping grease off his hands. "Back already?" he asked, half suspicious. "Couldn't stay away," Gray said with a lopsided grin. "Heard the bank's playing hardball. Figured I'd bring reinforcements." He nodded to the woman. "This is Clara Hayes, knows rural policy inside out. We're digging deeper." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Deeper how?" "Loans, infrastructure, real fixes," Gray said. "Your idea about leveling the field? It's growing legs." They sat at the kitchen table again, Clara spreading out charts. Loan rates, land values, corporate profits. Jake pointed at a spike. "That's them screwing us." "Yep," Clara said. "And this order's just the start. We're drafting a bill, permanent caps, fair pricing." Gray leaned in. "But I need your eyes, Thompson. DC's full of hot air. I want the dirt under your nails in the room." Jake hesitated, glancing at Emily. She nodded a quiet push. "All right," he said finally. "But I'm not leaving the farm." "Wouldn't ask you to," Gray replied. "You my boots on the ground." Outside, the field stretched wide, the first raindrops hitting the soil. Jake felt the weight lift, just a little. The bank might still fight, but now he had an ally with real power. And for the first time, he dared to believe they might actually win. The Iowa wind carried a chill as Jake Thompson stood in his fields, watching his kids chase each other through rows of knee-high corn. It had been a month since President Jonathan Gray's last visit, and the farm, once a heartbeat from foreclosure, breathed again. The executive order had held, stalling AgriCorp's land grab and forcing the bank to back off, at least for now. But Jake wasn't naive. He knew the fight was a long haul. The soil under his boots felt steadier, though, and that was something. Emily joined him, her hair whipping in the breeze, a rare smile softening her face. "Looks different, doesn't it?" she said. "Yeah," Jake murmured. "Like it's ours again." Inside, the kitchen table was cluttered with papers. Not auction notices this time, but drafts of a bill Clara Hayes had sent over. Jake had spent late nights poring over them, scribbling notes in the margins with a farmer's blunt logic. Gray's offer to join a council still rattled around his head. Him in D.C.? He'd said yes, reluctantly, but only if he could keep one foot in Iowa. The phone rang, shattering the quiet. Jake grabbed it, expecting Clara with more revisions. "Thompson," came Gray's voice, brisk and unmistakable. "You watching the news?" Jake frowned. "Not today." "What?" "Turn on Channel 7. He fumbled for the remote, flipping to the local station. A reporter stood in front of the Capitol, wind tugging at her scarf. "Breaking news. President Gray just signed the Rural Resilience Act into law, a landmark bill protecting small farmers from corporate monopolies. Caps on land ownership, price stabilization measures, and federal grants for infrastructure. It's a game changer, sparked by a farmer from Iowa named Jake Thompson." The screen cut to Gray at a podium, his tie straight for once. "This is for the backbone of America," he said. "People like Jake, who wouldn't let us forget." Jake's jaw dropped. Emily grabbed his arm, laughing through a gasp. "That's you." "Guess it is," he said, dazed. The kids barreled in, oblivious, tugging at his sleeves. He barely heard them, his name, on national TV, tied to a law that could save thousands like him. Days later, a familiar black SUV rolled up the drive. Gray climbed out, no entourage this time, just a man in a coat too light for the Iowa cold. Jake met him at the porch, hands shoved in his pockets. "You didn't warn me about the speech." Gray grinned, a flash of teeth. "Wanted it to hit you raw." "How's it feel?" "Unreal," Jake admitted. "But the bank's still grumbling. Says they'll sue." "Let him try," Gray said, unshaken. "This law's ironclad." Clara made sure. "We're not done, though. Walk with me." They trekked through the fields, the kids' laughter fading behind them. Gray kicked at a clod of dirt. "Council starts next week. I need your list. Roads, equipment, whatever keeps this place alive." Jake nodded, ticking off on his fingers. "Decent pavement, so trucks don't sink in mud. Irrigation upgrades. Our ditches are a joke. Credit lines that don't choke us. Modern gear we can actually afford." Gray pulled out his phone, typing fast. "Got it. We'll ram it through. You're my reality check. Keep me honest." "Deal," Jake said, a smirk tugging his lip. "But you're still a city guy. Ever driven a combine?" Gray laughed, sharp and real. "Not since I was a kid." "Show me." They climbed into Jake's old John Deere, its engine rumbling to life. Jake guided Gray's hands on the controls, the machine lurching forward through the corn. "This is what feeds the country," Jake shouted over the noise. Gray nodded, gripping the wheel, eyes on the endless rows. For a moment, they weren't president and farmer, just two men wrestling with something bigger than themselves. Back at the house, reporters swarmed, drawn by Gray's unscripted return. One shoved a mic at Jake. "Why'd he come back?" Jake shrugged, glancing at Gray. "Guess he gives a damn." The president clapped him on the shoulder, facing the cameras. "This guy's why we're winning. Farmers aren't invisible anymore." That night, over Emily's fried chicken and mashed potatoes, Gray stayed late, hashing out details with Jake. The phone kept buzzing. Farmers from Nebraska, Ohio, even California, thanking him. "You started this," one said. Jake just shook his head, half smiling. "I just yelled loud enough." Gray leaned back, fork in hand. "You did more than yell. You made it personal. That's power." As the SUV pulled away under a starlit sky, Jake stood with Emily, watching the taillights fade. "We changed it," she said softly. "We did," he agreed, pulling her close. The farm was safe, the law was real, and his voice, once a whisper in the wind, now carried weight. It started with a letter, a long shot, and a president who listened. Sometimes that's all it takes.